Hartley Ferrar was on the RSS Discovery that was went down to the Antarctic from 1901 to 1904 with Scott, and he was the geologist. He was a young man, he was an undergraduate at the time and just went onto the vessel. And we'll talk about the work that he did.
Just graduated?
Just graduated, yep, just graduated, yep. And here we see a picture of him in undertaking soil surveys in Central Otago. And you can see one of the maps behind him. Okay.
Let's push the page button. Page down.
Okay.
Nope.
Perhaps if we just press that.
Yep. Just hit that one there.
Okay, ka pai. So today's talk, we're going to talk about how archaeologists have been using maps, but had no idea about the person behind the maps. Brief bibliography of his life and his prodigious global career. I think you'll be amazed about what he got up to. An outline of his geological work in New Zealand. And then we're going to focus on the geological work in Northland, the importance of his maps to archaeologists, current archaeological research and his legacy, and also future research, what possibilities we have for future research.
That's it. Just hit that one, yep.
And so very brief, he was born in 1879 in Dublin and died in 1932 in Wellington. And in that short period of 53 years, he achieved a lot. And that's what we're going to talk about. And this is probably what he's most famous for, is being on the Discovery Expedition, the British National Antarctic Expedition, as a very young civilian geologist and recently graduated. So his personal life and career, he was born in Ireland. He was brought up in South Africa, where his father was a bank manager. He studied at the University of Cambridge between 1898 to 1901. And I think what stands out is not only was he a very good scholar, he was also a very good sportsman. He was captain of the boats and also captain of football. So you've got a smart, strong young man. And he stood out. And so the British Navy were looking for smart young men, and so he got shoulder tapped as a very young graduate geologist on Captain Scott's first Antarctic expedition. So I think the important thing is, especially for family members that are here, is that when they went into dry dock in Littleton, he met his future wife, Gladys Anderson. So that's the New Zealand connection, Gladys Anderson. And when he arrives into the Antarctic, he keeps himself busy in the field and the laboratory. You get a bit of a feel from some of the things that are written. He was a bit picked on because he was, partly because he was Irish, partly because he was young, and partly because he wasn't from the Navy. So he kept himself pretty immersed in his work. And Scott noted that he knows the features of numerous hills, slopes and valleys. He's always out and about. He's always in the field. He's always busy. And I think that's when they talk about energy, this man has energy to burn. And he crosses a large glacier flowing into McMurdo Sound, which is named after him. And also because of his inquisitive nature and his physicality, he's able to get out and explore a lot of places that people don't get to. They also name a type of rock called dolerite, and I'll show you a bit about that, and it's called the Ferrar dolerite. Here you can see it here. Here's the glacier. This is a picture of the Ferrar Glacier in 2009, and that's the one that he did, and you can, crossed, named after him, and that's where it's located. Here we can see this dolerite. It's this dark band that runs through here. This is the rock that's named after him, and this is sandstone either side of it. But the importance of some of these rock collections is this. I must say this is in 1928, a man by the name of Dr. W. Edwards, and I must say he is no relation of mine, in 1928 he split open some of the rocks that he had collected and found plant fossils. And the importance of that was that it showed that Antarctica was part of, had drifted. It was to do with continental drift. It was a really important part of that very early theory on continental drift theory. And here's an artist's rendition of what Antarctica looked like 120 million years ago. So his legacy is in the Antarctic is huge. He continued to publish and write all the way up until his death on his findings in Antarctica. I'm not a geologist, so I really haven't followed the geological material, but what I can say is he's had a huge impact on our understanding of that part of the planet. Now I'm going to go from ice to sand. And again, in 1905, he went to Egypt. And I think this is a remarkable juxtaposition. You can imagine you've been down in the snow, it's been incredibly cold, you're suffering from frostbite and scurvy, and next minute you're in Egypt in the sand and it's at the exact opposite temperatures and you've got to deal with heat. And he joined the geological section of the survey department, where he remained until 1913. So he was there for a big period of time. And what he was particularly interested in was geological surveys, which was looking at the cotton crops and irrigation and soils. And this became important a number of years later when he was looking at soils and irrigation and the susceptible of soils in Central Otago. So this work underpinned a lot of his New Zealand work. And as archaeologist, we found that he also did some more interesting stuff. There's a map, a mine map that was made in 1150, 11150 BC, which is called the Turin Papyrus. And what it is, it's a map which shows about a 15-kilometre stretch, and in that map they've drawn the geology, and they've also drawn the places of interest such as quarry sites, gold sites. So this was really the first geological map, and he published a paper on that in 1913 explaining his findings on that map. Also, he did some work. There was a large 12 kilometre long embankment at El Tod, and this he worked out was actually produced by human labour. So he had worked on not only on geology, but also worked on archaeology. And I think what it's showing is, because his science degree was a very broad-ranging science degree of natural sciences, he had an interest in most things, and he was able to pick stuff up. Then he went down to New Zealand to become the master of Christchurch College. So if there's any Christchurch College people here, there he is. He only lasted a year. He was called up into World War I, and he became part of the expeditionary force into Palestine. What he was doing was gathering intelligence, but importantly for us as archaeologists, what he was doing was looking at aerial photography, and he was looking at aerial photographs to work out where the Turkish positions were, how you could map them. And that, again, would stand much later stead for the work that he was doing in New Zealand about using aerial photography. So all of these things that he's doing in his early professional career are building up to what's happening here in Northland. And then we have a picture of the mind map, and you can see this is the, I think this is a river that flows through it here. And each bit is mapping the geology of that. Yeah, it's a 15-kilometre stretch of the Wadi Hamarat, a valley that included a stone quarry and a gold mine. Now we come into New Zealand. So after World War I, he joins the New Zealand Geological Survey, and for six years led mapping surveys in Northland from 1919. And what I can say, if you want to get a bit of flavour about what he was doing, there's an amazing collection of photographs that are held in the Albert Land Museum. They're called the Moore Collection. And they show his daily life of living in the field, living under canvas, going out. But interesting for me is you also see photographs of him sitting there and talking to people and gathering information. So he's using a whole series of approaches. And there's also him standing on hills with a pickaxe, chipping bits off. I can describe him, and he has been described as meticulous, hardworking and productive. And he and his team were looking, first of all, for coal and oil seams. And some of our maps that we have show all the coal mines, which would be interesting for people interested in coal mines in Northland. But also importantly for us as archaeologists, he was looking at soils. And soils for us are important because where you've got good soils, you've got populations of people in an archaeological sense. Good soils, lots of people. And these maps are not only doing the geological information, but for us as archaeologists, they provide us with archaeological information. And we were also talking before that they also provide social data. They tell us the names of families that were there, some of the homesteads, and if you know those, the whakapapa or genealogy of those people, you're able to track back and work out what's going on. Then in 1926, he did systematic surveys of soils and their suitability for irrigation. Again, that theme that we had in Egypt coming through. But also he was able to work on the Murchison earthquake, and he realised that looking at how people were killed, and some people were killed as a result of slope failures and landslides, and he was able to look at the sort of geology of those. And some of that work also informed later on in the Kaikoura earthquake. And then in the King Country, he was involved with soil surveys, mapping the areas of cobalt deficient soils. And this was important because we had what we call bush sickness. And bush sickness, the stock would be fed, they'd have lots of feed, but they would die. And so that was really important for actually understanding where those soils were. And then we could add cobalt into their feed and the stock would then remain healthy. Here's a picture of him out in the field, and if you look closely there, you can see Waipu School. I think the other thing about his legacy is when you look at the people he's been involved with. And basically what we can say is that he inspired people and other members of the group. So what we have is a number of people in that photograph. If we go from left to right, it's Leslie Grange, Hartley Ferrar, J.O. Hurst and Norman Taylor. A lot of those people succeeded in him and became part of the Geological Survey. So he was teaching as well as in passing on his knowledge. As I said, it was a life cut short. He was only 53 when he died. And in 1932, he'd been awarded a Doctors of Science by the University of New Zealand in recognition of his contribution to science. He was also the acting director of the New Zealand Geological Survey. So he was a man that really was at a peak of his career. And the other thing is that he was also publishing. There's a lot of work coming out of him. And in the 19th of April 1932, he died after a relatively minor operation in Wellington, leaving a wife and 4 children. And we have members of the family here today. And so they're part of the legacy, the legacy carries on. But we also have a legacy in his maps, his publications and his observations, which we today find incredibly important. Now, there is a whakatauki, which I think really sums it up. Pura tina ngā tonga tuku ihu e ngā tupuna he tiki hui, mā ngā ureo whakatipu Aotearoa. Keep the treasures handed down by the ancestors as an adornment for the descendants yet to be born in Aotearoa. If there's ever that stands true, it's from this man. He gave us a treasure and he's handed it on. And there's a number of people here whose talk I've used. Susanna Ferrar from Gateway Antarctica, Martin Esbrot from the School of Environment, University of Auckland. And if you want to look up, there's also some a YouTube, much wider, our talk on his sort of geological work. And for those that are interested in some of those photographs in Northland, there's also photographs from Peter Marsh. Peter Marsh sent me a link to those, and it's been really nice. I think the nice thing about it is the immediacy of it all. You know, we have someone's father that was there taking photos. We have the grandson here. We have other people here that are doing other sorts of work, and I think that's the thing. It's a big family. There's lots of people and it's that interconnection between the maps, archaeology, families, whakapapa, it's all here. So I'd just like to acknowledge all of that. And now I'm going to hand over to James. Kia ora, James.
I'm an archaeologist, and I was working in Auckland before I came up to Northland in the late 80s. And one of the things that we were discovering doing urban archaeology in Auckland was that the history of the sort of city was involved. You could start finding information in initially the geological bulletins, because back in the day, they would write these very readable articles and bulletins. If you look at a geological paper today, they have a very specialized language and nobody can understand them. So what's happened is they've gone from a generalist science to a specialist science. And so then by the 1940s in Auckland, that's what was going on. And then the flame was taken up by the geographers. And the same thing happened. They went from a generalist to a specialist. And then archaeologists came along in the 60s and 70s. And by the nature of archaeology, we're looking for association and linkages. While we can specialize, we have to be able to be a generalist as well. And so I sort of came across the geological bulletins at the time. And but then I came and worked in Taitokerau. So what is archaeology? I think it's appropriate since the last Indiana Jones movie had him in his 70s, and it's like it's 80s. But archaeo means ancient, and ology means the knowledge of. And it's looking at sort of prehistoric peoples and historic peoples. We have a very strong historic archaeological background. And in various places around the world, we're looking at artifacts, inscriptions, monuments, and other such remains. And in New Zealand, it's the monuments really that predominate. So for people who are not aware, the sort of monuments that you find in the sort of early sites and Māori sites prior to European arrival, you have things like the pā sites where you can see the lovely clear terracing, scarps and terraces, and that's important because we'll test you later on. And that's Rangihoa Pā near Marston Cross. We also have probably the most predominant type of archaeological site, which is the midden sites, which is basically rubbish that gets thrown away, because people look after their temples and stuff very well and they keep them nice and clean, but the rubbish shows you what people did as opposed to what they say they did, which is always quite interesting. And then you find things like this. These are kumara pits, which are a unique New Zealand innovation with post holes and structures there half excavated. And then, of course, we have plants. And the plants tell us stories about the past. So, for example, most of the plants in New Zealand relate to the ancient history of the Polynesians going way back from Southeast Asia. So you've got the taro and the yams and the gourds and the paper mulberry. But, of course, the kumara is from South America. And so, of course, that mere fact of finding the kumara in New Zealand and, of course, in the Hawaii of New Zealand shows the stories about how the voyaging through the Pacific got as far as South America is backed up by certain facts as well. So there's a sort of, this is the nature of archaeology. You're looking at information and layers of information telling you a story. One piece of information on its own isn't enough because we're skeptical. Now, into the historic period, you get a range of things as well, which most people will recognise. Here is the Kerikeri Basin with the stone store, third oldest stone building, and Kemp House, the oldest surviving wooden building from the early 1820s. Here you have the famous Kauri driving dams, which you find in many parts of Northland and Auckland and other parts of New Zealand. And here you have the relic of a shipwreck on the beach at Potu Peninsula in the Kaipara. And up here you have the drawing made by the British in 1845, one of the two drawings after the Battle of Ruapekapeka. So you can see the sort of nature of artifacts and sites that is relevant to us. We have a national database of archaeological sites. And many archaeologists around the world are quite jealous of this single database. We have over 70,000 recorded sites. And in Taitokerau, there's 17,000 of them. And I've just done a screen grab of basically, there's the Bay of Islands, there's Whangarei. And so this is just the midsection. And you can see each of these little stars is one site. Sometimes that site is a midden, that's this big. Sometimes, like Parihaka in Whangarei, it's 4 kilometres long. But the interesting thing about this database is the gaps between them. And anyone who does database studies know that the gaps can either be real and there's nothing there, or it could be that nobody's looked. And many places, especially in the Kaipara, with Turea House doing this work at the moment, you'll find that we have big gaps that mostly just the only sites recorded are past sites, mostly from aerial photographs and things like that. And so sometimes our secondary sources, in this case geological bulletins, can be quite valuable. So here is our page taken from the 1934 Kaipara subdivision map. So these beautiful books that were produced, I'm going to talk about the maps, but the book has all sorts of information in them. And what's interesting is it shows where the surveys were. So this one here, the Whangarei, was in 1908, and that was geological bulletin number 8. And then the Bay of Islands and Whangarei geological bulletin number 27 is that section, and that was from 1925. And then you have this very large Kaipara subdivision from 1934. We'll come back to that, so there'll be another question. This is the map I'd like to talk to you about, and it's also on the wall over there afterwards, so you can go and have a look and get into the detail of it. And this is the Bay of Islands and Whangaruru Survey District, and this is the published 4-inch to the mile map, because it's back in the pre-metric days. And here is a picture of this map. It's a beautiful colour-coded map. There are certain things that tell us where the original shape of the land came from. You can see the very weird shape to Urapukapuka, and that's because that particular part of the map came from a British Admiralty chart. And for some reason in the Bay of Islands, they always forgot the outer islands and they all did the inner stuff around Kerikeri and Kororaraka and Russell and things like that. So let's have a look in here. And in here, we start to find some very interesting historical information. So you've got there, for example, you can see Kororaraka Russell. Up here you can see Cape Brett, where there's the lighthouse, and the whole lighthouse history is really, really important to the European economy of New Zealand, because you had to get things like the wood and various other things out of the country, and it was a very dangerous place. So the colonial government at the time poured in vast amounts of money, relatively speaking, to have beacons and lighthouses and stuff like that and pilot stations. And a lot of them became really integral into local society. So for example, the bottom of Potu Peninsula in the Kaipara, which I'm not going to talk about today, the lighthouse today is part of the Māori community as well, because so many of those communities work together at that place. Here's Whangaruru whaling station. Here you have Tuihu, which is a battle site, during the 1845 wars. And of course, there is the seat of the first colonial government in 1840 after the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. So let's look at this enlargement. And here's the first time you're actually seeing this map really closely. So you've got people like Lane, who's a famous family name in Northland. You know, King Brothers Sawmill here. There's the Tuihu Pā site burned by the British after the Battle of Kororaraka, and that's where the pā is shown there. So they've got the pā symbols. There you've got Opua, and this is the railway line going back to the Kawakawa coalfields. Up here you can see the site of Old Russell and the Schmidt family which owned it. So you're starting to see some of the detail that they were putting onto these published maps. So go back to our map. Now let's have a look at some of these. These are our historic mining sites. So here, for example, in Orongo Bay, which is, when you get on the car ferry to go over to Russell, you swing around and you can see the cell tower up on the hill at Tiki Tiki Ore. There's the old manganese mines there. And what we know is they had a flying fox arrangement, bringing ore down to the water there, and where coal, where the scows used to pick it up. And if you drive past there at low tide, you can still see this big pile of rocks that the last load came down and it wasn't picked up. I was up on that hill in early 90s when they were putting that cell phone tower up there, and they put the foundation hole down. And I said, well, you do know about all the mine shafts underneath it. And the engineer turned white, and I showed him. They were literally 1/2 metre underneath their foundations. You could walk right through from one side to the other. But as you can see, there's other old manganese mines here, there's quartz here, and there's things like dolerite and stuff. And this is one of the things about Northland, and you can see it on the 1908 Geological Bulletin of Whangaroa, is that we have lots of bits and pieces of ore, but we don't have enough large amounts, except maybe for coal, to actually make it economically viable. So we go back to our bulletin again, and so I'm going to turn it on and off. You have to look closely. It's off, on. See those little red circles? Each one of those is a past site recorded by Hartley Ferrar. And as you can see, they focus around different communities. Here at Whangaruru, here down at Takao, over, even in Kororaka over here, and there's Otuihu there. And you can see, especially around here, out at the outer harbour, which is now the Ngāti Patukeha kaitiaki there. So let's have a look at Whangaruru Harbour. So here you have interesting stuff. There's all the geological material here with all these abbreviations and things, and these shear lines, and then there's this is a catchment zone through here. But you can actually see names turning up like Motu Kauri, and then you start seeing these little funny symbols here. And these are the published symbols for a pā site, and that's Hauwhenua pā, and then pā Pātio here, and then you start seeing another pā here but no name, and pā here, and then a pā here called Whakaturia. He spelled it Whakatuna, so he got that one a bit wrong. But what that shows is what's going on, and he's actually having to sit and talk to people. Yet again, you see the names of people. So each of these little houses has a person who was living there by 1925. There was a store there and a pā on that little Motu Kauri island. So, and some of these names have survived well, but some of them have not. So here, for example, is an aerial photograph, something like what Hartley Ferrar would have used. And this one dates from the 1940s, and so that pā site there is this pā site here. Now, you remember I showed you the terraces that we saw from an oblique angle? Here's a vertical angle, okay? And so the sun happens to be coming from this side, so that's the Tihi platform. That first dark line is the scarp. The next clear piece is a terrace. The next dark line is a scarp, so it steps down the hillside. And that's really interesting for my work on the Poor Knights Islands, but we won't get into that. But then you get all of this. That's a gardening system. Now it's wetlands, so it's going to be probably taro cultivation. Taro can grow in places up here, like at Kaitaia. Tangonge has shimmering taro leaves up near Kaitaia. But taro, which is a dominant crop in the Pacific, is not dominant in New Zealand because of climate. It's too cold. While they can grow it, it doesn't grow particularly well, and the reliability of it is not very good. So it became a secondary food source, which is why kumara became so important and why there's so many thousands of kumara pits in the hillsides.
When that photo was taken, were those a current thing, or were they historically?
They're historically visible. At that stage, it was just being farmed. It wasn't even ploughed. It's quite soggy, so this was just cattle. So some of these lines, like this one, is a fence line. Modern fence coming through the middle. But all of these, and this grid here, and these little dendritic patterns here and here, these are all pre-European gardening systems, of which we have a number of wetland gardening systems.
But that was still visible after 100 years.
Yeah, and when Hartley Ferrar was working in Egypt, for example, they were first time they were using aeroplanes and balloons to photograph for World War I in particular. And they did it in Europe a lot. But what they were finding was that in Egypt, they were finding these ancient wadi systems that nobody had even known about. So what happens, what you're actually seeing here is the differential between in water. So the grass in these little drains was more luxuriant than the grass on either side. So it's just a color change, and you wouldn't actually walking over it would hardly see any ditch at all. But the vegetation is better, and this is called crop marks, and they're very, very important in archaeology for us to find things in the past. So this is a lovely particular site. So we used aerial photographs as one of our secondary sources, and I would recommend that to Reo Hao. There's a close-up. You can see the pa. It's a beautiful pa. It's a lovely wedding cake step down the hillside pa site. And of course, that's characteristic of the Bay of Islands and Northland's east coast. You get into the Kaipara, and the pa sites change in the way they're designed, and it's partly the different topography, but it's also cultural. So that's our areas we're looking there. So let's have a look at Motu Kauri Island. Motu Kauri Island, there's many Motu Kauri Islands. And the name could well be ancient, but it could also relate to the logging period when great booms of wood were basically brought down the coastline to come into where the sawmills were. And so places like Whangarei, you think of all that flat land today around where the floral clock is and stuff like that, the water came right up to there. That's all been infilled, mostly with sawdust from giant mills that are long gone. But Motu Kauri is an interesting place. So here's our archaeological maps. As you can see, there's the gardening system. We've got a polygon around that. There's Motu Kauri, QR5634. And when I was working with the Department of Conservation, we went and had a look at it. And you can just make out some of those terraces. The sun's not in the right direction for this one, but you can just make out darker and lighter bands there. So aerial photographs, geological bulletins, telling us secondary sources, giving us hints. And that's the archaeological site drawing that we did. So, you're going to have to work with me on this. That's the tihi, that's the high point. And these are a series of terraces below the high point. So when you see these little arrows, it's slope. So these little zones of arrows are like the dark part on that aerial photograph. Okay? So it's how archaeologists are trying to show you height change on a two-dimensional piece of paper. So for us who do it all the time, we can't even look at a landscape anymore without seeing pa sites. But we forget. And this is a lovely pa. And down this is where a trading station is, just here. And this is a store, presumably owned by Miller. And it was a store where everyone got to by water. Because in those days, transport was by water for the most part. So there we go, missed it. So back when was it? COVID. During COVID times, Bill and his son William were walking along here, somewhere around here. And apart from William saying, you archaeologists, all you do is go around looking for clues, he came across this, which looks like a coin, but it's actually a token from a merchant called Haig Smith, who was based in Auckland. He was an ironmonger, and on one side there's the likeness of Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, and the other side says we know that and on the other had his token information. We know Samuel Smith arrived in 1859. He was a ship owner and an ironmonger, so we know the coin must date to that time. This was due to a shortage of coinage which New Zealand had, just like a shortage of bottles and all sorts of things. And of course, coins were de facto, like a Bitcoin, de facto currency, which works fine as long as you want to shop at the right place, but it doesn't work fine when you want to shop somewhere else or when that particular place goes bankrupt. So all sorts of interesting stuff going on there. So here we are back at our geological published map. Now, what we find is that each of the published maps was made of 4 unpublished field maps. They were inch to the mile, while the published one is 4 inches to the mile. So let's have a look at that one. And here it is. So you can see there's Mimifangata here, famous campground. There's Whangaruru here. There's Motu Kauri just there. And then here is where Whakaturia Pass site is. So it's got a lot of handwriting all over it. As you can see, the data in red, not to be published on the 4-mile map, reproduce only the geological data in black. So the stuff here that doesn't make it onto the published maps. So let's have a look. So they were starting to do the site maps in 1919, and the final published ones were 25, so somewhere between 1919 and 25, probably closer to 1919. So let's have a look at a place in particular. Here's a section around Oakra, and here you can see there's Oakra on the coast there, and there's you can see the word Oakra. Here you can see in this little circle here that I've highlighted, there's the little bit of vegetation. So over here, that's that bit of vegetation, and there's some other bits and pieces around. Now, that's kind of interesting because the vegetation tells you stuff about what was going on in terms of the clearance of the land. But also, if you're interested in climate change, you have these sort of things up here, and these are the mangrove zones, right? And so, while I haven't shown you much here, you can sort of see it here. So, one of the things that happened in New Zealand was with the deforestation, you ended up with a lot of siltation, and the mangroves expanded. So, things like that. But what I was particularly interested in was this little bit of information here. You see there's stuff going on, there's a road, and there's what looks like buildings, but there's nothing turning up on the published map. So there's an enlargement of that, and it's referred to as a mill, presumably a sawmill. And these are presumably buildings relating to the sawmill. And so we don't know anything about it. We don't know if there's anything still there, but it's a target. So these are why these maps allow you to see where things have happened in the past. They may or may not have anything surviving into the future, but they're quite useful. So future work. Well, I've showed you, and this is test number 3. Number 1, number 2, number 3, but all of this zone up here, isn't it sad? There are no geological bulletins for that area. So I've showed one particular section around the Hokianga. And what we find is that the Geological Service, GNS, which holds all of these maps that we talk about, they've actually got some preliminary inch-to-the-mile maps for that area. They never led to a bulletin because it stopped before they made bulletins. Because by the time they got to the point of making them, the Geological Service was now more focused on specific geological processes rather than these broad ones. So we have a look at that. So here is a section of the map, and there is Pipiwai up there, and you can see roads, quite a bit of geological map. You can see the streams running through here.
When we go to the GNS side, how do I find that? I found
Yes.
the other ones, how do I find these ones?
So in the main thing where there's 10,000 maps, you look for the title of the Mangakahia block. So if I just go back to here, this map, which turns up in the Geological Bulletin, number 34, has all the names: Mangakahia, Motatau, Punta Kiteri, Tutamoe.
So that was the survey district, and you've got the northeast, northwest,
Yeah,
southeast,
so that's right. Northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest. are the subsets. And so you can find it under that. So as you see here, this one is the Hokianga subdivision, the Mangakahia block field sheet northeast. Okay, so let's have a look at this area up the top here. Now the first thing you can see is that there are par symbols. Now he used a slightly different par symbol than you saw on the other ones, but you can see them there. They are recorded. I've put the New Zealand Archaeological Association site numbers next to them. So that's good. And what we find when we look at the archaeology is that they've actually surveyed on the ground, they've found a few more things. Because for every par site, you get a related range of site types, kumara pits and middens, whatever. But then, so for example, they've found a par there, but it's not on the geological map, okay? But then you have this one, an unrecorded par. So let's have a look at that. So this is known as Kawairanga hilltop. That symbol is for the hilltop. And that's a symbol for a trig station, which they recorded. But the symbol is there. So it's probably the name of the par, because they would have recorded that at some point in time. Here you can see an aerial photograph from 1942. And if you look closely, you can see it's on this ridge line here, and you can see the discoloration changes here. Now, you might have to work with me on this a bit. It's still covered with vegetation, and the later photographs are covered in even more vegetation. So you can't see it. But what it says to me, having done this for 30 years, that is definitely a par site. It's at the high point, making use of height for defense. And so it's at the right place at the right time. It's got a name, and it's got a par symbol. It's pretty, and what we find is that it's extremely rare to find Ferrar to have made a mistake. Sometimes he'll have a par symbol, and you'll find that it's not a par, that it's a kainga. But what it would have been is a place which people, which he was speaking with at the local communities, said that's our par. And of course, here the issue is with archaeologists. We refer to par as defended sites and kainga as undefended sites. But in the old days, hipar or par was the term for both. So we can't blame people for the fact they're not following my terminology, which I created after they died. So there you go. So this is future research. This is us looking at things. So, we've acknowledged people in the past, further into this thing, and we would like to acknowledge the family. And it's one of those things where people, I often find, don't have that much interest in Northland, and yet it's a very fascinating place. It is the cradle for both Māori and European history, and then it tends to become a bit of a backwater relatively. Now, again, this is the thing in archaeology where you convert a problem into an asset. Now we have archaeology relating to the early Polynesian settlement and the process of becoming Māori, the early European settlement and the process of becoming Pākehā New Zealanders, which ends up with completely unique type sites, and they're best preserved in Northland. So if there's ever going to be cultural tourism, it's going to be here, apart from the fact it's a beautiful place. So this is just a teaser, really. Thank you very much. We're open to questions. Ka kite. Yes, sir.
When you said they brought taro over from the island, someone asked me the other day, why didn't they bring bananas? Because they do well here.
Some bananas do well here now. I was giving a talk at the Tree Croppers Association 2 weeks ago in Whangarei, and the type of bananas that they are growing in New Zealand are actually ones which weren't available to that particular group of people coming through the Pacific. Similarly, the coconut grows well in New Zealand, but they use the high latitude coconut tree that's from higher up in the hills. And that does grow in New Zealand, but the standard tropical coral atoll coconut tree doesn't. And remember with plants, it's not just can I make something grow, it's can I make something grow regularly. You can grow taro on the west coast of the South Island. You just can't guarantee to get a crop out of it. You might say you'll have a crop failure 1 in every 4 or every 6 years. That's fine as long as it's every 4 years. But if it's 4 years in a row, you now no longer have a crop. It's the predictability of those sorts of crops. So, yeah, questions?
So the bananas that they had there were the Cavendish, no, that was the recent, wasn't it? So they didn't have the lady's fingers in the island.
No, well, the banana's quite interesting because they had breadfruit, and it wasn't banana later. I'm not sure of banana, because it's not New Zealand, my attention to it has been a bit minimal. But what you do find is that if you go to places like Mangaia in the Southern Cooks, which is part of the Hawaii homeland for the Polynesians who settled New Zealand, they have kumara there too. And we have excavated kumara from sites in the Society Islands dating to 1200 AD, which is before the first archaeological sites appear in New Zealand. And thank goodness they did, because if they didn't bring the kumara, the population would have been very much Northland based, and you would have only been able to do various things to the south. The horticultural line that zigzags through New Zealand, basically through Cook Strait, but catches Nelson and stuff like that. Above it, you can grow kumara, and below it, you can't with any degree of reliability. And that's where, above that line, you have 90% of the archaeology, and below that side, you have 10% of the archaeology. So if they just had taro, the line would be further north. If they had brought back white potato, as well as the kumara, the line would have been below the Antarctic islands, because you can actually grow white potato down there. And the whole history of iwi politics and power would have been radically different from what we know it today. There would have been as many people and many sites in the South Island as there are in the north. And while we have different hapu and iwi, as far as archaeologists are concerned, when we look at whakapapa and genealogy going back to Africa, we're going, you've differentiated yourself culturally, but every other criteria, I can't differentiate you. I can't say, oh, you're Te Reo Hau and you're Ngāpuhi, you know. I'll leave you with a last little thing. When Hartley Ferrar was working in the area of Te Ika a Ranginui, okay? So Te Ika a Ranginui is a battle site, the first major gunfighter battle site. It's a defining battle between Ngāpuhi as a group and Ngāti Whātua as a group. It's a bit like Glencoe in Scotland. It's a running battle. There's no archaeology that you can find. So is it an archaeological site? Probably not. Is it a culturally important site? Yes, it is. But what did Ferrar do? He's up there in the hills recording past sites and all sorts of stuff, and he goes, these are gunfighter pits. And I'm going, I know what pits look like on the ground. You've got kumara pits, you've got gum digging pits, you've got gunfighter pits. They're really hard to differentiate. Somebody in 1933 told him that these were gunfighter pits, and it's not the only occasion. 23. No, I'm talking about Kaipara now, which is after the 20s, in the early 30s. But in Potu, there are similar gunfighter pits, and these are the musket pits that you saw in the Ruapekapeka battle drawing. And this is where, this is where it proves that he's actually collating this information, because he was a Renaissance man. He was collecting information and trying to tell stories about the past in a very much an oratory Māori way, but using maps. Ka kite. Thank you. Yeah. But wait, there's more. Ka pai.
James, did Hartley do any mapping around Whakaangi?
No. So that area is, let's go back and have a little look. So Whakaangi is here. So that's in a zone where we haven't looked. But the future research, when I talk about, and I've got some stuff here, I know there's stuff here. I've actually got most of those secondary maps from there. I've spent the time to do it, but I've had to, my real job kicked in and I had to leave it for a while. I don't know if there's anything up here, but there's still another 9,500 maps to look through to find them, so there may well be the case. Yes.
So what's, sorry.
Sure, yeah. So look, if people are interested, give me your emails. I'll send you a PDF of this PowerPoint, and then you can do it, and you'll have a phone number on it, so you would send me an email, give us a question, because I'm sure questions will come up later, And it's always annoying. So just write your email down for me and I'll make sure I send it to anyone who's interested.
Okay, so he's obviously gotten the name of this place, that place, the other place.
Yeah.
Did he have journals about that and who he was talking to?
Look, he may well do. And and that's part and parcel of the research that has yet to be done. So I would imagine if you were, I know that surveyors, not geology, but surveyors, land surveyors, had to carry notebooks. It's clear from the photographs that he's recording information. There's the published books, which have a lot of information in it that I haven't even touched on because we didn't have time for it. So this should be some of the journals, but it depends at the time whether those things were considered property of the Geological Service or they were considered the property of the families. So, but luckily with the Ferrar family having this interest and ongoing interest in what he was doing, there is room for opportunity to either to approach GNS and to approach the families to see any of those archival informations there, because there's likely to be both. Couple.
I've heard that there are a lot of rich oral traditions when Polynesians were establishing themselves here in New Zealand. It goes quiet for a few centuries and it comes alive again, sort of 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Does archaeology, is that similar with archaeology? Like with there's big gaps where there aren't many paths being built and then the floodgates open and there's a lot being built? Or?
Not so much. Two things. With archaeology, we find early sites and they're particular type. The first explorers are here and then they return home and they come back with the first colonizing group. And they set up mostly coastal orientated sites all the way around New Zealand within the first living generation. And they've discovered pretty much all of the stone sources they need to do. And all the good gardening is pretty much found. Okay. You might have heard of Wairau Bar. This is a famous, what we call a site-type archaic or early Polynesian site, a process where people have stepped ashore and are starting the process of becoming Māori, which continues to this day. A bit like Europeans stepped ashore and started to become Pākehās. And it's only when somebody says from England, gosh, I can't tell the difference between you New Zealanders and Australians, that we get really uppity about it, because we can. And it's a very interesting difference. And what it is the difference is that it's a distinct cultural group, closely affiliated. So Māori are closely affiliated back into the Pacific. So what we find in the deep south, below that agricultural zone, Wairau Bar has been well excavated, and it's got very early settlements, and some of the isotopic analysis suggests that some of the people may be from the Pacific or definitely not from the locality. And then once the moa are gone, they can't garden, and so people leave. And what that means for archaeologists, and this is the secret that you're not allowed to tell anyone, is that it makes it easy for us because we have stratigraphy. What's at the bottom is old, what's at the top is young, and so you have the recent stuff, nothing there, moa hunting there, nothing there. Nice and simple stratigraphy. Nothing, something, nothing. But what happens in the far north is that these places which were for moa hunting and catching marine mammals, whales, sea lions, dolphins, these sites were never abandoned and they were continued to be reused into the future. So now they're overwritten by the modern stuff. Okay. So, but what we find in the archaeology is that you get a continuity. Some things stay the same, some things change. So for example, when Joseph Banks came with Cook, he was finding that the little tattooing chisels with these tiny little prongs on it were identical to ones he had seen 3 weeks earlier in the Society Islands. So that's a continuity of tradition from the homeland to New Zealand. But of course, in New Zealand, we have Māori with these wonderful spiral carvings on the cheeks, and that's not tattooing, that's scarification. That's actually creating a groove, and it's very painful, and it's a completely unique New Zealand development. So you get certain continuities and discontinuities. But what you have to understand about the traditional knowledge is that things that were important when they arrived here weren't necessarily so important later. So the ability to navigate and the ability to have seagoing double-hull canoes was very important to get to New Zealand. It was the end of a 3,000-year history of colonising the Pacific. And they got really good at it, because if you didn't, you tended to die. So they were quite good at it. But then once they got to New Zealand, it's 10 times larger than the rest of the islands in the Pacific. It's got climate. It's subtropical at best and subarctic at worst. And you don't need the navigation. And that high cost of keeping that knowledge going disappears. And the double-hull canoes disappear, except at the bottom of the South Island, when Cook reported seeing double-hull canoes down there because they had to go out to sea to get into the fjords. It's only when they've put the tunnels through that you can get to fjordland now. And we know a lot about this.
Also because they didn't have the bigger trees.
Well, they had a lot of trees. There's different arguments around that, but we'll leave that for the moment. But up in Micronesia, above Papua New Guinea and the Bismarcks and the Admiralties, is one of the settlement areas for Polynesians, or the Lapita people. And up there they have tiny islands, and they are right in the hurricane zone. And to this day, or at least to the 1970s, they still had families with the traditional voyaging knowledge because they had to tie their islands together to ensure their survival. And these whole families were doing this and couldn't do any other productive work. And so Dr. Lewis, a New Zealand doctor who was a yachty, went up there and visited them. And as you all may know, there is this renaissance in Waka Hora, the double-hull sailing canoes through the Pacific. There's about 15 of them now. The first one was the Hukulea, and it sailed from Tahiti to Hawaii, 4,000 kilometres. And the family's head from that group in Micronesia navigated there, and he had his island maps. He knew exactly where he was going, which is quite exciting. So, yes, sir.
Very interesting. His wife was also an archaeologist, also must have been very intellectual, because she also, from the university, but she must have also got remarried again to continue with her new husband, which was Gateway.
You'd have to talk to the family, sir, but I think it's just wonderful that we do have the family connection. We actually have whakapapa. We actually have living people talking about family. And that sort of thing is something which is really special in New Zealand. And archaeologists talk about whakapapa, it's just that we tend to go back to Africa, so it's a bit longer, but it's the same thing. And of course, one of the great things in Pakeha New Zealand society is genealogy, trying to trace yourself back. And it's amazing how many people trace themselves back to William the Conqueror. And how few trace themselves back to the 100,000 Celtic slaves that were there, So genealogy is wonderful, especially in Māori society, because you can choose which side you want to go down. So my colleague Atarere Heihei, who is both Ngāpuhi from up here, but also Ngāti Hau, when she goes down to the Coromandel, it's like, well, one side of my family are here, and you're the last of the 30 that were left after the other side of my family came down and killed everyone, So, kapa, uncle.
You mentioned Te Karanganui. I'm descended from Ngāti Whātua, but also Ngāti Whātua and Ngāpuhi is one family.
Yes.
So just having a bit of a squabble.
Yes.
But the Ngāti Whātua was practically decimated because of the muskets. But it wasn't because the muskets were dangerous. The Māoris had an honour in fighting. When the musket was being reloaded, they sat down. They wouldn't fight because it was a dishonour to kill somebody while he wasn't ready for action. So as soon as they put the gun up, they jumped up and boom. Not only Ngāti Whātua did that, but also it would have been reversed if Ngāti Whātua had the guns. Ngāpuhi would have sat down and boom. But it's funny how culture is. But it's all about the honour and integrity of the person. Pardon? Well, it's changed
I've-
now.
There's many a story that I could talk about. If people wish to leave, please feel free to do so. My boss will tell you that it's not getting me to start talking that's the problem. But if I could use the example of Ruapekapeka, Māori society was tribal, chiefly, complex chiefly based societies, which means as a leader you have both, you'll have your genealogy that gives you the right to be the chief, but you also have to earn the right as well. If you're no good, you won't be put into one of those positions. So there they are at Ruapekapeka, and after the Battle of Ohaiwai and various others. And what happens with the English? The English are a state-level society. They haven't been chiefly based tribes since the Roman period. And they have multiple layers of society, and the people at the bottom have much less power. So when at Ohaiwai and they ran out of ammunition, they decided to do a frontal assault. And so that it got formalised to an extent in the British Army that if you want to do a frontal assault, it's called the Forlorn Hope. And you are chosen from your Irish and your Midlands privates, and you're given a gold guinea and a big meal, and you're probably dead tomorrow. And Tamaki Wakanene was looking at this going, what are you doing? This is a frontal assault. They've got a cannon with red hot bullet chain in it, and they've got crossfire from all these muskets. So he sent, one of the soldiers was sent off to do a scouting, and he was an interesting guy. He used to wear a monocle, and he was quite popular. And they said, Peter, go away, we have to kill you. So at Ruapekapeka, when Colonel Blomfeld, Despard said, right, frontal assault, Tamaki Wakanene said, no, Governor Gray, please take over. Because as far as he was concerned, what it's telling us is about different social organisations. And then, of course, what happened after the battles was that Māori society became staunchly Christian, and all of the battle site British soldiers that were buried in a mass grave, unless you were an officer, you weren't actually taken away, were petitioned to Parliament to uplift them and rebury them in a cemetery. And so if you go to Ohaiwai, you can see the mass grave there of the British soldiers, which local Māori had uplifted. And so the only ones they couldn't find were Ruapekapeka. And that was because fire had gone through the little graveyard and stock had gone on and they couldn't find it. And there were questions in Parliament in 1914. Where are these graves? And my colleague Jonathan Carpenter and Bill and I were lucky enough to be there in 2017 when the soldiers were rediscovered. And so now they're memorialised. And it was something that Ramo Akawati had been wanting to do since when I first met him in 1990, because you don't walk over dead people, don't eat food over dead people. And so he was in an old people's home and he had only a couple of weeks to live, but his daughter told him about that. So we managed to achieve one of those particular goals. But what it is, it's telling stories about people and how people view the past, you know? So, and that's why archaeology and traditional knowledge and traditional history in everybody's heads is such an important thing, and why you can actually pull stories together here that you struggle to do in other parts of the world. So for example, Australia was also empty of people when the ancestors to the traditional owners, the Aborigines, came in, but it was 50 to 80,000 years ago, and none of those stories have survived. You've only got archaeology. Now, if you've only got archaeology, it can get quite boring. As my wife says, it's not quite as interesting as you think it is, James. But when you can put people back into the thing, and here we're talking about Mr. Ferrar, you know, I have such a degree of respect because he's a mapping person and I do landscape mapping. So I'm looking at these going, this is gold. This allows you to have a chance to look back when, you know, people had different diseases and dislocation in the, you know, around World War II, people were moving away to the city, loss of knowledge. And sometimes these become little windows into the past. And I think it's magnificent. Thank you. Yes, sir?
Very interesting topic. With Kelly, my son, doing the research for, and that the maps, especially around our area, Tai Tokoro, he's doing the past sites. We only thought there was 2 or 3 past sites. but when he did the actual research, there was just around Tukatuka Mine itself, there was about 40
Yes.
past sites. And just over the hill a little bit, what another 40, and across the river, there was another 40. So the research work is bringing forth that hidden history.
And that's why the Kaipara is so important. This harbour is the second largest harbour in the southern hemisphere, and we know so little about it. And it was hugely valuable in the days when you had waka. When ships came in, it became a bit more problematic because you actually had only certain places you could get deep-hulled ships in. But it's a really important place, and it's been a backwater. It's only now starting to have development pressures coming onto it. So it's those sorts of places you need to get into. If you look on Google Earth at Bailey's Beach, you'll see past sites within 3 kilometres of it, at least 4 or 5, and they're unrecorded. You know, you can find them different. So we use geological bulletin maps. We use aerial photographs going back in time through retro lens and stuff like that. It's all online. We do field surveys with all sorts of stuff. But Kaipara is underrepresented. And every time you find a past site, you can be pretty sure, because that's a defended hill fort for a settlement, there's going to be 20 to 50 other sites around it. Whether they have any archaeological visibility is another matter, but there will be undefended kaiinga, there's going to be rubbish dumps, there's going to be burial sites, because everyone's got to be buried somewhere. So, but you also start finding early industries. In the Hokianga, for example, there's a Catholic tidal-powered flour mill. Unlike a stream-powered flour mill, this just had a head of about 3 inches, but it was quite a big pond. So for 2 hours a day, they could run their flour mill. And this is because the Catholics were from France, and they had this particular technology back there, and that's why, for example, the printery in Russell is made of pounded earth, which is what the French had in that particular part of France. So you can see connections. And with Pompeilia coming back, you know, it's all that thing. I'm sorry. I think that's enough. But I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. And, you know, thank you so much for coming. It's been a privilege to have you here.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much, everybody. And there's a huge amount of work to be done, as always. And James is incredibly enthusiastic, and it's trying to get all these resources together. And if I can just put a plug in for the work that Kelly's doing in the Kaipara. At the moment, they're looking at doing planning for the district plan and the Kaipara District Council, and they're looking at sites of significance to Māori. So the work that Te Uri Hau and other people are doing in that area is really, really important, because it's so underrepresented, the knowledge that we have of the Kaipara. And as James said, it's an incredibly rich place, and everywhere you look, you see stuff. So,
Yeah. Thank you.